so we'll try to sort of collect where we've been and where we're going. First question, have you been reading The Family Crucible?
What did you say?
There's a book called The Family Crucible, which is sort of parallel to this course. It's on the syllabus. It's a book that's in the library. It's easy to get, in English used. The Family Crucible is not this course. It's a description of a full-length treatment done by one of the founders of family therapy named Carl Whitaker, with a junior assistant named Gus Napier, who later became a very famous couples therapist. And it's a story about the Bryce family. And from this week on, I'll be using the Bryce family as the family that we'll be talking about as an example, and so we have a family that we know about. So if you haven't had a chance yet to start The Family Crucible, you'll find it not like the reading of this course. You'll like it. It's a very popular book. It's still in print for 40 years. There's a reason for it, and you'll get to know one family in detail. The other advantage of the Bryce family and The Family Crucible is that there's not a word in there of any of the theory that we're doing. Nothing. It's completely different. It's a different view. And that's a good thing. In other words, if you look at the Bryce family through the lens of how the therapist looked at them and what happened in the therapy, and what we're talking about and how we're trying to understand the theory, you'll have two different points of view. The more the merrier. Because
it's on our syllabus.
It's on the syllabus. Yeah, on the first page of the syllabus it says there's a book called The Family Crucible. That's in essence the closest thing to a textbook, but it's not that we're going to talk about what the theory that's in there. We're going to use the family that's in there. But because it's a full-length treatment, it'll first of all give you a sense of what a full-length family therapy treatment is. It's a pretty wild treatment. It's not one that is for beginners, but it'll give you the idea of how family therapy started. And the main thing is that it gives us a family that we're going to be talking about. Now, the family is the Bryce family, and we'll meet the Bryce family in the next unit. The Bryce family had all sorts of what the Americans call issues. One of them was not an affair. So the chapter about affairs is a separate chapter, and what we're going to talk about today is about couples, and we're going to use the non-Bryce family. One chapter, it's in the syllabus, which chapter we're dealing with. There's one chapter about another couple, not the Bryce families. That's the couple we're going to talk about today, okay? But what? This is not the Bryce family. It's a different couple that they use to illustrate something or other. And I'm going to use it to illustrate something different, but when you read the chapter, you'll get to know these people too. So if you recall, hopefully you recall, that up until now what we've been doing is trying to understand the way that a co-creation gets lost in families, right? In other words, what we've started to discuss is the fact that the way that two people face-to-face recreate each other, influence, could we close the door please? Influence each other and change in relationship is connected to the mirror neurons, to the way things happen face-to-face. It's connected to the idea that Buber put forth almost 100 years ago of I and Thou, a meeting that happens between people where something actually happens between the people. And when we looked at differentiation, we tried to look at differentiation as when differentiation works better, those kinds of meetings are more available. If you recall, we refer to those kinds of meetings, we can call them co-creation, we can call them intersubjective, right? And we can call them higher differentiated, we can call them I and Thou. You see, we're talking about different ways, different lenses to look at what happens between two people, with the idea that where there's low differentiation, something about regulation takes place in the family, which doesn't allow room for growth. The family is fine but can't grow. The world is moving, and the family has to grow because it has to deal with new ages of children, schools, losses, all sorts of things happen in families. So a family is always challenged to be able to recreate itself. And the laboratory where the family recreates itself is in the face-to-face contact between each member of a dyad. And when that's not possible, the family regulates rather than recreates, and then the family has a challenge that is essentially managing itself based on the past and not based on the present. So now, up until now, you would assume that, okay, as long as you have two people and not three, things should be sababa, as they say in Israel. Things should be okay, right? Because between two people, there's not a triangle. And two people, why shouldn't they be involved in intersubjective? Why shouldn't they be involved in co-creation? What would keep them from that relationship? Anybody started seeing couples yet? Those of you who are seeing couples will immediately say, what are you talking about? I see these couples and they're all regulating all the time. And they're avoiding co-creation. And I don't know what to do. Like, what's my role? How am I supposed to help them? What are they afraid of? So today's topic is how it's possible to get into a mess with just two people. See, family therapy is based on the fact that messes start with three people, but couples therapy is based on the fact that you can get into a mess with just two people. What kind of a mess? That's what we're going to try to understand today. The main beginning of this is the word complementarity. What we're going to try to do is understand from the inside what a complementary system between two people looks like, how it regulates, how it works, and how it can change. Okay? So to do that, we're going to meet John and Eleanor, not the Bryce family. It's that chapter, not of the Bryce family, in the Family Crucible. And John and Eleanor come in for couples treatment because of an affair. And the affair happens, as it usually happens, is the husband's affair. It happens because something in the couple is not working well. In other words, when you see a couple and there's an affair, there's the ethical judgment, which is somebody's right and somebody's wrong, and there's a clinical insight that it probably something's not working between the two people. In other words, it's not one person's affair or another's, it's a couple that isn't working, and the affair is an expression of it. That's not an ethical statement. It's a useful statement clinically, because if it's just one person's the matter, so you just have to fix one person, and then you're not going to fix what happens between the people. So we're looking at it without a moral judgment here, just to try to understand how the couple works and doesn't work. So John has a alcoholic mother, and his alcoholic mother divorced from his estranged, cold father, which is a sort of, very sketchy, when John was 10. You see how you can use the genogram to designate an age, or the way we did it before, you just put a certain age, and John is 10, and he loses his father and becomes his father. In other words, why did his father divorce his mother? Because his mother was swallowing him up with her neediness, which when she wasn't drinking, she was drinking her husband. Her husband left, so now she's drinking her son. So John's issue is that in close relationships, I lose my eye. I disappear. I get swallowed up. That's called engulfment, right? And men are particularly susceptible to feeling engulfed when people say hello to them. And in this case, John comes to the marriage with a sensitivity in the area of engulfment. In other words, when he comes home and his wife says, "How are you?" he has a sensitivity which could be expressed as, "What do you want from me now?" Right? How are you engulfing me? What are you taking away from me? If we need to demonstrate anything in regulation, right? We're not. So we have a candidate. Welcome. Eleanor, we don't know much about her. It's just, from the chapter. Are we having a regulation problem? Too hot, too cold?
Regulate the heat.
Yeah. See, the best way to do regulation in the winter in Jerusalem, the best way to do it is not to pay too much attention to it. Somebody feels hot, turn it off. Somebody feels cold, go turn it on. Not worth discussion. Okay? It's because otherwise we'll just be regulating the whole time and we won't have an intersubjective experience here in the room, which is what you paid for. So, so just, turn it on, turn it off, and it'll be all right. So Eleanor comes from an opposite experience where her parents paid little attention to her, and her sensitivity is a sensitivity about abandonment. Do you see that that's sort of opposite? Right? In other words, when Eleanor, John comes home and she says, "How are you?" which is, "Are you going to stay with me?" And he feels, "Oh my God, you're swallowing me up." He moves away from her. So what does she feel? Not, "Oh, he needs a little space." I'm abandoned. What does she do when she feels abandoned? She says, "You can't abandon me." He runs away further. So there's an interesting choice here, which is not uncommon. In other words, if you say, you see, if we talk about the area of engulfment and abandonment, remember we talked about the three major emotional issues which you can use to focus and understand what's happening. One of them is closeness, one of them is self-worth, and one of them is control. Do you remember that?
No.
Okay. Well, we'll wait for a moment for the room to get settled, and then this is not a theoretical statement, this is a clinical statement, and it's not meant to be exhaustive. But when you say to yourself, what's going on in the room? The room is a complicated room in family therapy. Lots of things are going on. It's hard to sort of take a focus. And you say, well, what is the main emotional issue that's going on? There are three main emotional issues. Usually one of them is dominant in a given family, or at a given moment at least. And the three major emotional issues, which don't cover 100% because that's not where we're going. There is no such thing as 100%, but they cover, I'd say, about 80% of what goes on in clinical work, is managing closeness, managing self-esteem, and managing control. In Hebrew we say, koach, kavod, kirva. Closeness, self-esteem, and control. Right? If you think about what couples fight about, they fight about, are we close enough? Do you love me? They fight about, do you respect me? And they fight about who's in control of who, right? So that's just a way of looking at it. In this case, the major issue, if it's engulfment and abandonment, what's the major issue? Closeness, right? Will the other two be involved? Sure. That's how people are. In other words, when John feels engulfed, he says, "You're not respecting me too." But the main issue is closeness. And when Eleanor says, "You're abandoning me," it's a way you're trying to control me by it. They get connected. But the main issue in this particular case is closeness. That will not be the case in all couples you see. That's why I'm saying that. In other words, don't get the idea that if engulfment and abandonment is what happens with John and Eleanor, all couples are struggling with engulfment and abandonment. Some couples are struggling with a balance of self-esteem, and some people are struggling with a balance of control. Now, John and Eleanor chose each other. And if you say, is this working, was this a good choice or a bad choice or a challenging choice or an issues choice, however you want to say it, it's a problematic choice. You see, from the point of view of regulation, it's going to be a problematic choice because they're opposites, right? In other words, every time Eleanor's going to want closeness, John's going to run away. Every time he runs away, she's going to want more closeness. So it's not going to solve anything, right? On the other hand, if you look at it from the intersubjective point of view and say, do they have something to learn from each other? Do they have something that they could create that could make them feel more whole? The answer is sure. John, if he married Eleanor, who was also worried about engulfment, he wouldn't be able to learn much about himself. This way he has somebody who can accept him because she's different. Eleanor, who's worried about abandonment, has a close relationship with somebody who can understand her, because that's not his issue. It doesn't threaten him. So there's an element of choice in complementary couples which looks towards a possibility of change, a possibility of intersubjective, a possibility of a meeting, but the regulation gets in the way, right? Yeah.
So you're saying, is this true of most couples, that most couples end up, whether, I mean, in Haredi societies, we don't have time to choose based on what we know of the other person, very often, exactly, we're not choosing emotionally like that, but do we assume that most couples have some sort of complementary issue that they end up regulating around, but that is the very issue that they can grow most out of?
See, Debbie's asking a generalizing question. And the generalizing question is my answer, unfortunately, is I don't know. Does it happen enough that it's useful to think about it in clinical work? Oh, yeah. Is it recognizable in normal couples? For example, the people who are sitting here in the room? Yeah. In other words, elements of this kind of a cycle are normal. They happen all the time. The question in clinical work is when they get out of control. You see, where did we get to the idea of complementarity? The idea of complementarity doesn't come from couples. It comes from somebody who you will learn to admire, respect, and hate, named Gregory Bateson. Ever hear of Gregory Bateson? Gregory Bateson is famous for being the one really important thinker in the 20th century who is known mainly as Margaret Mead's husband. Right? Margaret Mead was more important than Gregory Bateson. But Gregory Bateson was the think tank of systems theory. In other words, when you needed to say, people said, well, this is happening, Bateson would say, oh, I have an idea. And his ideas were foundational, the same way that Milton Erickson's intuitions were foundational. And family therapy without Gregory Bateson and Milton Erickson would have dried up in a minute, just moving chairs. So Bateson is the thinker, and anybody who really wants to have a good time with a challenging book, Gregory Bateson, Steps to an Ecology of the Mind. Steps to an Ecology of the Mind. Now, Bateson was, among other things, Margaret Mead's husband, so he did some anthropology as well, aside from thinking. And he ran across this tribe in New Guinea called the Iatmul. It's not on the test. There isn't a test, so it can't be on the test. You don't have to remember who the Iatmul are. But if you read the stuff in the reader, you'll find the Iatmul. And the Iatmul was this tribe in New Guinea. Well, that doesn't sound like family therapy exactly, but he was observing processes between groups. And what he saw is that when things got too crowded, that things are sort of balanced in a certain way, and the balance was sort of complementary. And when things got too crowded, and the crowd, you needed to say, time for the young people to go and make a colony. That happens in Haredi families too. Time for somebody in Gur to move to Arad, for example. So how is it time? Who manages that? How is it that people change the function and move in a different way? And that involved what are called symmetrical processes. Things got out of hand, and there was a lot of pain involved, but that was the mechanism of change. So the idea of the complementary relationship actually doesn't come from couples, but it's useful for looking at it, and now we're going to look at it together. Now, the first thing about John and Eleanor is that Eleanor has a story, and her story is that I say to John, come close to me, and he runs away. Now that is not a cycle. That's a linear statement, right? A causes B. I say, John, come close, and John runs away. A causes B. It's a linear story, right? Now, it's important for us to recognize that people live in linear stories, right? In other words, when we experience ourselves, we don't experience the whole cycle. We see a part of it. So Eleanor's part of it is that she sees, I turn to John, and he rejects me. That's linear. We're starting with that because that's the symptom. Eleanor comes in and says, when I turn to John, he moves away. Now, what we'll see shortly why it's important to respect the linear part of it, even though we're about to turn it into a circle. We're going to turn this statement into a circle. Why do we want to turn it into a circle? Because it keeps happening. She says, it keeps happening. I go near him and he runs away. And then I go near him and then he goes around. And she thinks of it as linear, but she's describing something circular. It keeps happening. The question is, how does it keep happening? Now, the other thing is that when Eleanor turns to John, you ask John, and what's your story? And he says, every time she turns to me, I need to run away. Oh, so he agrees, right? He just puts the blame on the other side. But it's the same linear story. In other words, the couple agree that when Eleanor wants closeness, John runs away. So the couple agree to recognize Eleanor's need for closeness, right? In other words, that's less threatening. John runs away. He doesn't say, I need something from her. I say, she's the problem. I'm just the result. But the two of them agree that she initiates what's called the linear part of the story. See, once it's a circle, there's no initiation. But the circle has a linear aspect to it. And the linear aspect is that it initiates with Eleanor. It means Eleanor has a need for closeness. We both can recognize that she has a need for closeness. The rest of it they don't recognize. So it's more available clinically. We'll get to why that's important in a minute. So now, if we say, well, let's take Eleanor turns to John and say, wait a minute, what happens to Eleanor? In other words, we're saying that if you're looking from the outside, Eleanor turns to John. Let's look from the inside. Let's try to understand what is happening to Eleanor. What's her inner process that makes her turn to John, and what is John's inner process that makes him turn away. So if we do that, instead of looking at Eleanor turns to John and John, we're going to look at something like this. When Eleanor turns to John before he moves away, right? She's doing something. There's something going on in Eleanor. She's saying, come close to me. So at that moment, she's connecting with feeling not rejected. She wants closeness. She doesn't go to him so that he'll reject her. She goes to him because she wants closeness. So she is at that point, as she's turning to John, she's not rejected. And what about when John moves away from her? When John moves away from her, he has an inner story as well, not just an outer story. Why does he move away from her? He's feeling engulfed. Okay, so now if we look at this, we say, well, wait a minute. There's something that looks like it's sort of simultaneous. What looks simultaneous here? What looks simultaneous is something that happens to the two of them together, that when Eleanor is, you use your best judgment. Little peeps like that don't bother me at all. Actually, big peeps don't bother me either, but figure out for the class what our peep economy is. So, you see, what's happened, the organization is that when Eleanor is feeling not rejected, John is feeling engulfed. That happens simultaneously. It's expressed as if it's one causes the other. But actually, when she's feeling not rejected, that's when he's feeling engulfed, right? And then he's going to move away from her.
So it's happening simultaneously.
So we're putting them simultaneously. We're taking the inner story of Eleanor and the inner story of John and making them simultaneous rather than one causes the other, right? This is how the balance takes place. Yeah?
I thought that they were never one causes the other. It was that Eleanor did feel rejected and therefore John felt engulfed and moved away. But not feeling rejected was always simultaneous.
Well, you see, when she says, come close, at the time when she's saying come close, what is her inner state? Rejected? Not yet. He hasn't moved away yet, right? So at the time when she's saying, come to me, she's feeling hopeful about closeness.
But
Right.
that's on the other side. Eleanor.
No, it's not. You're right. You see, go on. We have to work it out. What I'm telling you is counterintuitive. It's counterintuitive. It'll help us to understand something, but it's counterintuitive. It feels always like if she didn't go and say, "Get close to me," he wouldn't run away. She makes him run away. But when she's saying, "Come close to me," what is her inner state? Rejected? Why would she be saying, "Come close to me," if she's feeling rejected? She's feeling at the time that there's hope. She's feeling the possibility of closeness. It's not going to work, but she's feeling the possibility of closeness. But simultaneous with her feeling of the possibility of closeness is John's feeling engulfed. That happened together. This is a different way of looking at it. You're not going to be able to see it on the screen. It's a theory, right? Yeah.
But to me, it seems like a cause. It's a cause and effect, because there's something there's something about Eleanor and the way she is seeking to connect with them.
Right.
It's making him feel engulfed.
Right, that's the linear story. That's the linear story. That you make me, it's because of the way you ask me that I feel engulfed, right? So if you could ask me in the right way, we'll get to that in a minute. But when she's saying, "Come close to me," is she already feeling rejected? At the time that she's saying, "Come close to me," she wants closeness. So then we're saying, for the sake of argument, let's say that she's feeling better about the possibility of closeness, simultaneously with John feeling less good about closeness. Rivka?
So I'm just wondering how this connects to, like, let's say, other theories in couples work with pursuing and distancing. So let's say Eleanor has a need to pursue John, and the impact of Eleanor's pursuit of him is engulfs him, which
Right, but when she pursues him, at the time that she's pursuing him, would we see her as feeling rejected already, or is feeling that there's a possibility for closeness?
But the question I have is what's the impetus that pushes Eleanor to pursue?
That will come.
Is that resting on a place
That comes at a different point in the circle. That's exactly. We'll get to that in a minute. You see, what we're doing is trying to look at the circle as a circle. If we say she drives him nuts, he gets cold, that drives her nuts. So we're going to have a kind of a flip-flop, but we're not going to have a circle that we can work with. We'll just have a circle of blaming. You do this to me, I do this to you. We're trying to create something that's different than that, to try to understand what we can do about it. Yeah.
I feel like sometimes, though, a person could feel abandoned and then therefore reach out more. Like, how do we know that she's not feeling abandoned? Like,
But we're just making up a theory.
oh,
Yeah. In other words, this is not what you do clinically in the room, right? It's not as if you say, "Oh, Eleanor, you're looking for closeness because you feel rejected." We're trying to put the "because" aside, because we're trying to look at something that's not linear. When you have a circle, and it acts like a circle because it keeps happening. She says it too, it keeps happening. So if it keeps happening, then maybe causality is not useful for us. It's useful for a fight, right? That's how complementary couples come in, fighting. You do this to me, you do this to me, you do this to me. So now what are we going to do with that, right? So we're trying to find out something that we can do about the fact that it's a circle. And so for the sake of argument, we're saying that when she says, "Come close to me," we're not right this moment looking at why she's saying that. I can't compete with little babies. I'm not even going to try. But Rivka can. There's a difference between saying, "Why are you feeling that you want closeness?" and the fact that you're asking for closeness. They're different, right? In other words, see what we're trying to do? We're trying to make ourselves different kind of clinicians. An individual clinician will always say what you just said, what all of you were saying, says, "Oh, sweetheart, you were feeling rejected, and that's why you were looking for closeness." So then we say to ourselves, "Okay, so what are you feeling now, rejected or close?" Right? Because you get confused between why you're asking for closeness, and that you're asking for closeness. When you're asking for closeness, you're connecting to closeness, not connecting to rejection. Somebody who's connected to rejection isn't going to ask for closeness, right? So we're trying to say that when you're asking for closeness, you're connecting to the side of you that's more positive, the side that's more hopeful. Yeah. There's, I say, a hand while I just finished. Yeah.
But just explaining the cycle, or in EFT language would be, let's say, explaining the dance that's happening
Right.
in this couple. Is that enough to create the shift? If there's something still about Eleanor that feels rejected.
Something that what?
If there's still something about Eleanor
Yeah.
that makes her feel rejected, I mean to say there's something about her past, and about her process that she has to work through.
Exactly.
So that really means to say that individual therapy needs to happen concurrently with couples therapy.
Right. So when you've just made a lot of moves, as they like to say in philosophy, right? That what you've said is that there's something that she brings with her that makes her sensitive to feeling rejected. Yes. Are we going to get to that in the cycle? As we move along, we will. She needs individual therapy to solve that. That's a different move, right? See, it's easy to say, and that's what I'm hoping we'll get past, but that's where people start from. They say, look, what's a couple? It's two people with issues, right? So you get these two people with issues, and each of them solve their issues, and when they finish with their issues, they'll be a good couple. And if they can't, so we'll clean up the mess in couples therapy. That's logical. However, some of you will meet John, sent by somebody for individual therapy, and you say, John, what's your problem? And he says, my problem is Eleanor. I said, no, John, get off of it. That's not your problem. And out the door he goes. Or you do it with a little bit more patience. And you say, well, tell me about your problem. He says, well, Eleanor does this, and Eleanor does this, and Eleanor does this. John, what about you? What are you feeling? I'm feeling that Eleanor does this, and Eleanor does that. And I say, well, but John, we want to understand how you feel. He said, I feel that Eleanor does this, and this, and this. And she's just like my mother, but so what? I don't live with my mother now. I live with Eleanor. And if Eleanor would change, I would be fine. He said, well, let's try to understand how you could be fine even with Eleanor not changing. He said, I could be fine when you make her change. You have an idea what I can do to make her change? And the answer is, I think we could try, right, struggling, right? We're working, huh? We're trying to get to this individual therapy. He said, look, you're a person. He said, I'm a person who's suffering because of Eleanor. When I'm not with Eleanor, I'm okay. So he says, so why are you here? I said, I don't know, my psychiatrist sent me here. He said, but look, let's see if we can figure out what I can do for you. He said, you can fix Eleanor, okay? And so then Eleanor comes into the next room to the individual therapist and says, what can I do for you? I'm miserable. Why are you miserable? I'm rejected. Are you always rejected? With John, I am. And so, what about you makes you feel rejected? John. And then you just get endless stories. Now, you will meet people like this. I'm not making this up, right? In other words, the idea that you can always do individual therapy before you can do couples therapy is not robust in the world. It's a wish list. In other words, everybody would wish that all you really need to do couples therapy is sit in the room with these two people and do individual therapy in parallel. Can you do that with people like you? Yeah. In other words, where the differentiation is higher, where people are able to say, it's me, help me with my part of it. So then you can see a couple and it'll look like you're doing therapy with John, therapy with Eleanor, therapy with John, and it's fine, you're not working on the couple, you don't have to, right? That's when the differentiation is higher, 10 to 20% of the time in clinical work, higher in private work, but not over 40 even in private work. That'll be there. And from those people you can learn, and those people you suffer from less. You feel like you're sweating less. But there will be many couples who are so swallowed up in the system that there isn't an individual to talk to. You see, that's what we're talking about. The complementary cycle swallows the individual up. John only sees Eleanor as the problem. Eleanor only sees John as the problem. See, when you made as an individual therapist thinking, you say to yourself, okay, it's linear. She does this to him, he does this to her, let's take them separately, right? But what you didn't think of is that if that's how they see it, then I can't help either of them, right? Because John says my problem is Eleanor. Eleanor says my problem is John. They're talking your language. He does this, she does that. But they're not talking the other side of the language because they're so involved in the complementary cycle, they can't stick their noses out of it. That's where the system swallows the individual and swallows the possibility. The regulation swallows the possibility for intersubjectivity, right? Yeah.
So in this kind of situation, this is a general question, sorry.
That's okay. You know what you're going to...
Only answer.
Right.
Is there anything to do in individual therapy, or do you have to bring that couple together?
Right. When you see couples and the individual cannot become an individual in therapy, then it's a good idea to be able to try to couple. But then you have to know what to do with the couple, and that's what I'm trying to teach you, right? In other words, if it's a couple where John comes in and says, listen, I know that I have these issues, I brought them from my mother, my story was this and that, I've been in therapy for 15 years, and I just need to straighten some things up because there's something mysterious with me and Eleanor I don't understand, help me. So take the bracha and help him. That's very nice. But if he doesn't come in and says that, he says, I was fine and I'm fine at work, but when I come home she drives me nuts. You may find that she's going to drive you nuts if you don't bring the couple in, right? So we're looking for another option in a situation where individual therapy seems to be mostly about complaining about the spouse. You unfortunately will meet that. And so what I'm trying to do is to give you a way of thinking, and based on the way of thinking, a way of performing that could allow you to see a couple like this when you can't say to John just by himself, listen, it's your issue, right? And so you need to see the couple, then what are you going to do? Because he says she does it to me, and she says he does it to me, and so what next? So to get to the what next, we're trying to make a different kind of structure to release ourselves from the only linear way of thinking, right? Then that's why we're working hard, because individual therapy is mainly linear, right? Freud's thinking was mostly linear, and Freud thought that he could deal with people who had a very high level of differentiation, and the rest of them, he said, I don't know what to do. And when they talked about their families, Freud said, I don't know what to do about families. They just drive me crazy and they ruin therapy, right? That's a way of saying that my way of therapy doesn't work for those people. And so I hope somebody figures something else out. 50 years later, people started to work on something different. So we're trying to, and it's not easy work, to say as a therapist, who am I looking at the couple? Am I looking at John, looking at Eleanor, looking at John, looking at Eleanor, or am I looking at the relationship between John and Eleanor, the system? How it's the system, it swallows them up and doesn't allow them to be John and Eleanor. That's a different way of thinking, okay? So we're trying to look at it sort of to free ourselves from only linear thinking. Is linear thinking bad? No. Take any slice of a circle, it'll look like a line, right? But we're trying to see something bigger because that's where they're stuck. That's what's swallowing them up. That's where the suffering is taking place. So not for the sake of that, what we're doing is putting together a situation where when Eleanor is feeling better, John is feeling worse. That's the fundamental organization of the complementary cycle. When I'm okay, you're not okay, right? Now, then that situation of Eleanor feeling better and John feeling worse creates a movement. John does something. Now, we could say it's linear. Eleanor's making John do something. Or we could say the arrangement between the two, where if she's okay, he's not okay, then creates a movement in the system. It's not John's rejecting Eleanor, it's their movement. It's a part of the cycle. It belongs to both of them. When he's moving away, it belongs to both of them. What does it do? When John rejects Eleanor, see, we made this into a system. Now, guess what happens when John rejects Eleanor?
She feels rejected.
When he
Abandoned.
feels better,
Oh, he feels better.
right? He was feeling engulfed before. He's going to feel better, and she's going to feel worse, right?
Could you say that again?
What?
Could you say that again?
Yeah. When John moves away from Eleanor, he says, "Leave me alone. I have a headache."
Oh, so now he doesn't feel engulfed anymore, but she...
Exactly. He has freed himself from his pit, which is engulfment. He's feeling better, and she's feeling worse. Okay. So then you see we have these two situations. A situation where Eleanor has a plus and John has a minus. They do something. Not he does something. They do something. He now feels better. She feels worse. And then what happens? Then, you see, this is where we redeem the statement that you were trying to make linear. And then she will turn to John. But when we say she turns to John, we say no. It's actually the two of them are making a movement. It's in her mouth. Because we have a situation which is good and not good. So we need to move it along. You see, now we have something that looks like a circle, right? In other words, after John creates the flip, where he's okay and she's not, Eleanor creates the next flip, and then she's okay and he's not, and then he does he flips it the other way. You see where the circle comes in? So we put the causality in a different place. It's there. And so,
She's not hopeful anymore.
what's that?
She's not hopeful anymore.
When she's not hopeful, so then she does something to become hopeful.
She has a cycle of start.
She becomes she has a negative and he has a plus, right? So she needs to flip her negative, and she does that by turning to him and saying, "I could have closeness," right? And then she's plus and he's minus, and then he flips it.
Even before she wants to come close to him, he'll be the negative.
Right. See, the part that's hard to swallow. Right.
How does that negative positive flip?
Right. The part that's hard to swallow is what?
No, the part that she's not rejected anymore, like that she...
Well, you see, we have a mystery. Why does this keep happening? Right? Why you say, well, why don't people learn from experience? Right? Like, why does she bother? Why does she?
Even if she does bother, I think maybe she'll bother, but I don't think the bothering, when she bothers, it's not, she definitely feels rejected, even if she is bothered.
Before she goes and asks for closeness, she feels rejected. That's here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even when she asks for closeness,
And then-
I still think she feels rejected. Like,
Yeah.
I
It's a
don't
double-
know if
it's
it's
a double
coming from a
feeling.
place of not feeling rejected. That
I
doesn't
agree.
make
I
so
agree.
much sense.
Okay.
I think it's a feeling.
So now we're starting to free ourselves from linear thinking a little bit, right? Because now we're saying, let's try to work on it. We got to work on this together, but there's work here. What we're trying to say, I want to take your statement seriously, right? A moment of regulation, right? You're saying, I want to think linearly, but it doesn't work. Because why is she banging her head against the wall with this stone cold husband? Why is she saying, come close to me? She knows, after all, that he's not going to get close, so why does she do it? And
I understand why she even does it.
why does she do it? What do you
Because
understand?
it's coming from like a need of maybe desperation, or women aren't always so rational. I'm saying, I understand the concept. I just don't think it's coming from a place of not feeling
When
rejected.
does she not feel rejected? I think that's
That's where it doesn't bother me that she's trying again. I think it's
What-
just like a...
why doesn't it bother you? It bothered you just a minute ago. Okay, let's take all the objections.
But doesn't it come
You see,
from motivation of...
no, this is going to be fun. You see, no matter how you stir it, something doesn't make sense if you look at it as individuals. Got it? Something doesn't make sense if you look at them just as individuals. Something will start to make sense if you look at the way they manage the relationship. The way the relationship is balanced, it will start to make sense. Otherwise, it doesn't make any linear sense.
For me, what bothers me is that statement, Eleanor not rejected. Those three words it doesn't make sense that she doesn't.
Good. Okay. More problems, yeah.
There you go.
I'm wondering that.
We're not in therapy. You can just say it without wondering. I know that you've all been taught that to never say anything without wondering. But out with it.
Rejects her.
What, I can't hear you. What?
When he rejects her, he feels better. So he's feeling better. It lasts probably longer, right? I mean, that's like just, and her hope is very it's very short because he rejects her immediately. It's still important for the process. Is that important?
Yeah, and she comes
Okay.
back and forth.
If you're starting to say that the linear model makes more problems than gives it answers, you're starting to get it. The linear model will make you go crazy with Eleanor and with John. It'll drive you nuts. Why? Because they keep doing something that doesn't work. Unless you say to yourself, maybe something is working and I'm not seeing what's working. A useful way to think in general, when somebody, you say, well, the couple should be solving their problem, right? That's X. We say, you should be solving this problem. You should be figuring out the X. And they're not doing X, so the intuitive way of looking at it is to say, they're not doing X. A useful way of looking at it is to say, they're doing Y. They're doing something else, right? If you remember, when we looked at intersubjective experience, and we said that's X, right? They should, higher differentiation, they should be doing differentiation, they should be doing co-creation. If they're not doing co-creation, should we leave them with Bowen and say, well, they're just not differentiated, just they're not doing X, X is differentiated? Or should we say, well, what's a Y? What are they doing? People don't just do something that doesn't work. They're doing something else that we're not seeing. What is the why? What is this couple doing all the time that is working in a way that we're not seeing? Right? It's not solving their problem, but maybe it's keeping them together.
It's maintaining the system.
It's maintaining the system, which is intersubjective or regulating.
Regulating.
Okay, so then the complementary cycle is a form of regulation. And because all of our linear statements, all of them, about what is John feeling before or after, what is Eleanor feeling, they're all intersubjective questions. They don't work to explain regulation. So the therapist who thinks intersubjectively and wants to perform intersubjectively and goes nuts with people who don't cooperate that because they're not doing intersubjective work. Eleanor, why are you doing that? What are you feeling? She says, I don't know, but we just keep doing it. So I said, well, I guess if you're not doing X, if you're not doing intersubjective work, not with him and not with me, maybe we're doing Y. And Y is regulating. Y is protecting. Y is keeping things together in a way that everybody bellyaches about all the time, but it's doing something. It's doing something else. When you're not doing intersubjective, creating, you're doing regulatory protecting. You're holding things together and having a miserable time at it. Why are you having a miserable time at it? Because it doesn't allow for intersubjectivity. People, see, that's why we put in Buber here, right? Because people feel they need intersubjectivity. To feel whole, you need to be able to do something different. You need to be able to grow, create something new. When you can't, so you feel stifled, but you're also protecting something that may not be able to bear it. Am I making any sense at all here? We're sort of, this is good. You're not swallowing some sort of Lockshare. You're fighting with me. That's good. We're moving out of linear thinking. This is where we start to think systems. Yeah.
So basically, in order to think systems, we have to step away from what motivates. Because it's a system that motivates us. We can't think about, well, how's Eleanor feeling and what she, where does it come from and what's John. We have to leave it on the side in order just to see what the system movement is. Is that correct?
Everybody get that? Because I wasn't able to say it that way, but everybody get that?
Yeah.
That's coming from Yeah, that is it. Exactly. Now, is that easy to do? No. Nobody thinks systems. People think lines. People think linearly. People think motivation, because motivation is a linear thought. Eleanor wants something, right? So we say, well, if she wants, this is yes, but that isn't necessarily how the system works. That's how it would be if we could say to her, Eleanor, and she would say, I'm here. I'm not stuck in the system with John. I'm here. Eleanor. Then we could say to her, what are you feeling? What's motivating? We could do that, right? But if she's not here because she's more in the system, then we can't talk to her as if she's not in the system. We have to talk to the system. Now, it's important to remember that the reason why we want to talk to the system is to help the system to free itself up. We want to help people to free themselves from system. All systems treatment is anti-system treatment. The system is not our friend. The system is what regulates.
So we get into the system to break it.
What? We get into the system to help it to grow. That's an important word, to break it. If you try to break it, they will break you. Because the system is always much stronger than the therapist. But if you can understand how the system works, then you can help it to change. Right, but only from understanding what Debbie said before. You have to understand it not just from X, motivations, who's motivating and why they're doing this, and it's nuts, to Y, which is that this is a system of two people where the two people don't feel like two people. In the subjective, two people feel like two people. They do I and thou. Two people who feel like we're just stuck in this horrible marriage, they don't feel like two people. They feel like they're stuck in a horrible marriage. You want to talk to them like two people, talk to yourself, talk to the wall. It won't help them. Yeah?
How would that look different than?
We're going to get to that. As soon as we finish the cycle, we're going to say, and then what on earth do you do with it? How do you talk to a system? How do you talk to a system? Yeah?
And it seems like it would seem that when you just break the system as a level of treatment, and you're just dealing with symptoms rather than like let's say if you're not getting into your head of what happened to you as a child that you're pursuing, whatever it is,
Right.
and you're not
Right.
it'll just crop up somewhere else even if you break that system.
Exactly. In other words, everybody hear that? We say, well, wait a minute, we just want to treat the system? How's that going to help anybody to grow? That's a useful question. In other words, one of the problems with family therapy when it was initiated was that some of the people who were pushing family therapy said, I can change symptoms, that's all people want. That was based on thinking in the 70s and 80s that the client decides what they want. That is a useless notion in the sense that how would the client know what they want? In other words, if you go back to Freud, people walk in because they're suffering, but they're suffering from things that they don't know, so how do they know, right? So people who are in a system, they want something, but they don't necessarily know what they want. So you'll see when we get to a strategic therapy, was based on, I can make this symptom go away. Some of the times people grow from it and sometimes not. But there's nothing that contradicts one or the other. In other words, what you need in your question, the answer to your question is time. Do you remember the complementary cycle graph that we saw? That if you're dealing with regulation, then you have to deal with regulation and know how to deal with regulation. But the point is not to finish at regulation. The point is that once you're free from over-regulating, where there are no two people, there's only a system, then you become free to be two people who can talk to each other as two people and continue the therapy further. The whole goal of therapy is to go from regulation to intersubjective, not to just find a different regulation.
Can you explain a little bit more at some point how you go from regulation to intersubjective?
I would like to do that. We're on the way to that. We're on the way to that. Right. This is going to be the exact. This is the, well, it's processing, but in a different way. So, first of all, we're trying to allow ourselves to see the regulation of the system as our client right now. That's not the end of therapy, that's the beginning of therapy, right? If that's where we're at, that Eleanor doesn't feel like she's Eleanor. She feels like she's John's rejected wife. And John doesn't feel like he's John. He feels like he's Eleanor's engulfed husband. So we need to see how that works, and then try to... So now, look at this. See, we took Eleanor feeling better and John feeling worse, simultaneous. And we took Eleanor feeling bad and John feeling better, simultaneous. And we put them as two poles of the complementary couple. In other words, the system is based on the fact that when I feel good, you don't. And when you feel good, I don't. We're calling them pluses and minuses just to make it simpler. Now, what would be the advantage of a system like this? The disadvantage is obvious, right? That they never feel good together. Complementary couples never feel good together, right? So how are they going to be able to get the intersubjective if they never feel good together? So what would be the advantage of it, of something like this? The advantage is that they never feel bad together, right? Oh, and if you think that the goal of a couples therapist is to make them feel bad together, you will have a very short career in couples therapy. You'll be fired faster than you can imagine. But it's always there at the brink. In other words, the couple is protecting itself from feeling bad together.
Get to that? Like,
What?
Is it normal that they might get to that as part of the...
If they get to that, it'll explode. We're going to get to that in the next...
They can't handle that.
In the complementary cycle, the complementary cycle is meant on protecting them from that. Because if John is feeling engulfed at the same time that Eleanor is feeling rejected,
They're out.
they're out. They're out. Does everybody follow that? If John is feeling engulfed at the same time that Eleanor, they're both getting worse and worse and worse, right? He's feeling more rejected and she's feeling more, he's feeling more engulfed and she's feeling more rejected. It's going to go out of control. That's a symmetrical cycle. We'll get to that.
That's exactly what happens in
What?
this situation, I feel like.
In the affair, that's exactly what happened.
No, not the affair. I mean, how long, this little dynamic lasts for about a second, but as soon as
Oh, no.
he gets rejected, she's feeling bad.
No, 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 no.
As soon as John's
A cou-
involved, he'll say, okay, get away, but he's still feeling.
Right.
Even if he's, once
But-
he says it, he's not like, ooh, that was a close one. He's like still feeling it.
Everybody hear the linear intersubjective, who's feeling what? We're looking at, zoom out a little, zoom out and say, but it keeps going back to the same point. You see, a complementary cycle is well balanced in the sense that it keeps going back to the same point. It doesn't go anywhere. That's how it swallows people up. That's how it protects them from exploding. So then, if that is what, yeah.
No, I just want to say you're making it look like very nice and pretty girl, like it all works, we never feel good together, never feel bad together. I wonder if like John, the engulfed, but there's obviously other emotions and ideas that could contribute to feeling good or bad
Right.
that are not being spoken of here.
Right.
At the same time as John doesn't feel engulfed anymore, there could be other feelings that will arise for
Guilt.
him. I think of like that idea that could contribute to him also feeling bad.
Right.
Like feeling like I can't please my wife because I feel engulfed.
Yeah.
Or like,
Right.
it's just, I don't know, I think there's other dynamics that aren't being considered.
Right. See, all of these objections are crucial to be able to enable you to put that aside. It's not that it's not true. See, when we said, well, let's look at closeness as the main thing, that's all of the people we're going to, that's all that's going on with John, is just that he's engulfed or he's not engulfed? No, he's a human being. But we are a therapist here, and we need to focus. All of therapy makes choices. All of therapy makes choices. There is no therapy, except perhaps for an hour a day, 6 days a week, psychoanalysis. There is no therapy where the therapist can afford to lose focus. The therapist is making choices all the time about what am I doing now. So your question is the intersubjective question, which is, okay, now let me just understand you deeply, John. I need to understand what you feel other than being engulfed. But you're imagining John being able to do that. And John is not a person who can do that now because he's too busy in the cycle. To understand the cycle, we are swamped. See, once you put one person in the room, you're swamped with all sorts of information. Put two people in a room, it's exponential, right? It's not linear. And you have an explosion of information. What he feels, what she feels. And that's where therapists lose it, right? Because they lose their focus. They say, okay, well, that's very interesting, and okay, well, that's very interesting, and then the session is over and nothing has happened, except the therapist has been writing like crazy and is going to run to their supervisor to say, what do I do with all this information? And the answer is, focus. It's your choice. It's now, in individual therapy, it's easy to delude yourself into thinking that I'm just a passive receptive vehicle, and the person comes in and I'm just receiving what they have to say, and that they're really leading the therapy. That happens 10% of the time. That's great. When that happens, you have a person who's able to use the intersubjective moment of meeting with a therapist to be able to move ahead by themselves. When that happens, you make a bracha rishona and achrona. It's a wonderful thing. But you can't count on it, because not all of your clients are going to be able to do that. And one of the things that I'm trying to keep focusing on here is we need to make ourselves as therapists do what the clients need. And if a client can't do the kind of therapy that I would really like to do, then what do we say to the client? They have two choices. Either I change or you change, right? And the idea that you're going to change and fit yourself into the therapy is not robust. By that I mean it don't work, right? So then I say, well, can I change myself? Can I change the way that I look at you? Can I change my focus? Can I change my zoom? Can I look at things? Can I choose to focus in a way that will make something work better for you in the realm of regulation? And once we get to better regulation, we can move towards something else. But how can I go into the area of regulation? Now, some of you will say, who on earth wants to do that? I didn't become a therapist to learn about regulation. I became a therapist to hear people do intersubjective work with me. That's fine. Don't work with couples, or work only with those couples who can do that kind of work. Most couples are busy with the complementary cycle, and so we're trying to expand your repertoire, but not bekoach. People who say, no, thanks, that's very interesting, let me keep that out there, I'm never going to do that. Okay, you know, at least you've seen what you're never going to do. And if you see a client where you say to yourself, at least you'll know who to refer to, right? So let's take a look back at, there was another, yeah.
Yes, I'm just wondering if this is someone...
Stop wondering, just ask.
You've trained us well.
Yeah, what's your question?
It's a good word in therapy, let me tell you.
What? No, after the fifth time that you've said it, your clients, listen, some of you have been in therapy, so then they go and tell their sister, you know, the therapist is always wondering, you know. It's a sort of a mannerism that you can use a little, but you don't need to use it a lot. You can just be straightforward, yeah. So what's your question? See if you can do it.
I'm trying to be very straightforward. I wonder if this is someone...
See, it's hard to get out of it. Okay. This is, you know, that's for a different course.
Similar to when a couple experiences a crisis,
Yeah.
some sort of grief or loss, they lose a child, there's always going to be one spouse that is feeling less demoralized than the other.
Say that again, if you're in a crisis, what?
Well, a couple experiences,
Yeah.
say they lose a child of some sort.
Right.
There's always going to be one spouse that is feeling a little bit more hopeless than the other.
Right.
Right? And when that couple, and that spouse is feeling hopeless, it's the other one that gives the other one the support, and then it shifts.
Right.
So is it similar to this construct of...
It will start to look like this, but it won't be as rigid. In other words, complementary cycles are a way of regulating. People do it all the time as part of the couple that they are, but not all the time, and not only, right? In other words, when the complementary cycle is not working, then it swallows up the possibility of saying, how are we doing? John and Eleanor never ask, how are we doing? They can't get out of the cycle to say, how on earth, what are we involved in? They're busy in the cycle. When they're in the cycle, they sound intersubjective. You do this to me, you do this to me, I feel this, you feel that. But they're in the cycle. They're not able to do anything except flip-flop, flip-flop. So, but complementary process, you know, happens all, it's like, you know, those of you who've heard about the projective identification. Have you heard about it, projective identification? It's not from Carl Rogers. It's from the opposite end of the spectrum, from a lunatic named Melanie Klein. Brilliant lunatic. But the idea of projective identification is that instead of knowing what I feel, I get you to feel what I can't bother to feel in myself. The complementary cycle is based on that. Melanie Klein drove people crazy for about 7 decades by saying that that's a sign that you're a total nut if you do projective identification. Until somebody in San Francisco took it together, his name is Thomas Ogden, and said, what are you talking about? People do this all the time. That's how people communicate. The only question is if you can do other things as well. Right? In other words, all the regulatory functions are 80 or 90% of what people do. When they become 100% of what people do, right? That's when you start to get stuck. So the complementary cycles protect couples and balance them. So, for example, your question about a crisis, let's say, God forbid, a family loses a child. So people will find a way to help each other, find a way to stay together. That will include complementary aspects. In a healthy situation, it will not only include complementary aspects. If it becomes only complementary, then the family becomes involved only in regulation, and the differentiation of the family diminishes, and people feel less well in the family, right? So one of the things that you'll see happening in a healthy family is that there'll be regulatory aspects and intersubjective aspects, right? It's when the complementary cycle, or whatever regulatory cycle goes on, becomes exclusive of intersubjective. For example, if the husband says to himself, I can't really listen to what you really feel. It scares the daylights out of me. Let's just keep balancing. I'm helping you, let's do it this way. That's when the differentiation will go down. Crises are always a crossroads where the differentiation can go up or down, depending on whether the intersubjective is supported or not. And a lot of crisis intervention, if you think about it, some of you learned crisis intervention at some point. There's a whole field of crisis intervention. I don't know if there should be a field of crisis intervention, but there is. But if you zoom out on it and say, okay, at a point of crisis, things are going to be going regulatory. And the issue is to help it to become regulated enough to then grow out back into the intersubjective. In other words, the differentiation will go down as long as it can go up again. We've done a good intervention. One of the problems with crisis intervention is that some of the people who created the theory thought that the whole idea was to regulate back, and they did a lot of damage, because the idea was, look, you guys are fine, why do you need to talk about it? You know, you're fine, you're fine, you're fine, you're fine. It's all a lot of regulation without looking at the intersubjective, which needs to grow out of it. So that's just, since you asked about a crisis, what you want to think about in a crisis is to recognize the regulatory aspects. The differentiation has to go down in some ways to re-regulate, but then you want people to be able to get back to their robust ability to co-create, I and thou, intersubjective. You see where we're going? So now you had a question?
I just had a quick question. So basically, because I think the definition, the term...
Just a minute. We just heard a question without I wonder. You guys are moving out.
The term complementary couple, in other words, it's not complementary at all. It's regulated. It's like, just so I can think in my head when you say complementary, you really mean like they're opposites, which could be bad thing sometimes or a good thing depending. That's what you're saying.
Complementary. Complement with an E.
Complementary. Like an A.
Complementary with an E. Right. This is not, there are no complements here. Right. Complements is intersubjective. This is complementary. One complements the other. It means it fills, right? The P-L-E comes from to fill, and C-O-M means together. So people fill in for each other. Right? Complementary is not, the P-L-I is a different word. What?
I want to hear what comes next. Those complementary arts.
Wait, something is just, a small miracle has happened. It's a little late for Al-Hanisim. But Debbie said she wants to hear what comes next. Anybody else want to hear what comes next? Okay, so I've annoyed you enough that you want to hear what comes next. It's a very useful tool in therapy. When people seem not to be listening to the therapist, Milton Erickson used to sort of ignore them and look out the window. And they would say, "Why are you looking out the window?" And he would say to himself, "To get your attention. Now that you asked me why, let's get back to therapy." Okay, so if this is the structure, and this structure protects them from getting into the two pits together, but it limits them from doing intersubjective work. So then we would say, well, let's look at how this structure is regulated. How does it work? And the answer is that there are these movements. You see, how do you go from Eleanor minus and John plus to Eleanor plus and John minus? Eleanor does something. So then it's not exactly Eleanor does something. That's the linear intersubjective way of thinking. Why is she doing it? What is she trying to accomplish? Eleanor's turning to John doesn't belong to Eleanor. It belongs to the two of them. The two of them participate in it. The function is Eleanor turns to John, but it's a function that regulates for the two of them, and then it re-regulates with John rejecting Eleanor, which is not exactly John rejecting Eleanor. It's the way the two of them go back and forth. Okay? So now we've zoomed out and we've looked at an intersubjective, at a complementary cycle, which is regulatory, and you see the individuals seem to disappear. Huh? But that's how they live. You see, we want them to be individuals, but they're not living that way. So if we want to say, look, don't live that way, the X is being individuals, do that, and they're not doing that, and we can't see what the Y is. This is the Y. Right? That they're running a perfectly regulated complementary cycle. In this case, because when you get back to this point, it's always the same point. And when you do it at this point, it's always the same. It doesn't escalate. It just stays the same. That's how a complementary cycle works. It stays the same. It protects them. And if you say to yourself, so what on earth is your relationship? The answer is, this is our relationship. And this is a safe relationship. Is it ever good? No. Is it ever bad? No. Is it ever good and bad? It's always good and bad, right? Can it ever change? No. Not this way, right? Because as long as we need to protect this is the glue that keeps us together. See, somebody said the dance, we are part of this dance. That's who we are. We dance this dance, and if we don't dance this dance, there's not going to be any we. Huh? Because there's a ticking bomb here. The ticking bomb is, I need space, I can't tolerate space. I need space, I can't tolerate space. That's right? That's good. What?
So John was right when he said Eleanor is my problem.
Say that again?
He said Eleanor is my problem. He was right. Because otherwise, with all his other dances, with all his other relationships, he is doing fine. It's
okay, but we're zooming out and saying that John Eleanor, this cycle is both my problem and my solution. In other words, I need this. I can't imagine we could live better than this. It could only get worse because we could go into explosion, but it's not good enough. Okay? Now, why is it not good enough? The therapists said to themselves, you're strangling each other. In the way that you're living, there's no room for co-creation. So you're stuck, you feel stuck. On the other hand, you feel protected. So let's talk about how it's protected, and then we can talk about how we could grow. We made some progress. You see, if you can see this cycle and not keep worrying about why Eleanor feels this way or that way, but to see that that's how it seems to work. It's how it seems to work. This is empirical. We're not explaining why it has to be. It seems that it works this way. That when she's plus, he's minus. When she's minus, he's plus. And the things that they do, you see that it sounds sort of dehumanizing. You say to yourself, well, Eleanor is not really turning to John. That doesn't sound right, does it? But in this cycle, that's how it works. In other words, if you say, well, why do you feel that you need to turn to John? You say, but that is not how I'm living. That's your question. That's not my question. My question is that, I don't know, I just keep doing it. And in some ways, you would say, we keep doing it. We keep doing it. The way that it's done is that it's from my mouth. I say, come close. For example, there will be couples that will drive you a little bit crazier, where instead of Eleanor turning to John, John invites it. He comes home and says, Eleanor, come close. John, right? And at that point, Eleanor feels not rejected. There, you can see that. But he's doing it to himself. He's feeling engulfed. And then Eleanor says to him, not now, I have a headache, right? And it looks as if it's fakir, because if she needs the closest, why is he doing that? And the answer is he's not doing it, she's not doing it, they're doing it. And if they're doing it, it could work one way or the other. Otherwise, it's very hard to understand those couples where instead of Eleanor turning to John, John invites, but it works the same way.
Does
he
he
says,
reject her then?
what's that?
Does he then reject her?
Oh, no, then she rejects him.
Rejects him?
Yeah.
She's the one who wants to vote.
Right, so it looks paradoxical. It looks like everybody's doing upside down. But if you say it's not Eleanor doing it, it's not John doing it, it's the way that they dance, right? If it's the way that they dance, it doesn't matter who does it. The main thing is that it flips it this way and it flips it that way, and it always comes back to the same point, so it is secure. Things that come back to the same point are never, it's not, the way you think of security, you think of something stationary. But, nothing is stationary. So what's secure is a movement that keeps repeating itself. That's called the circle, right? And a circle that keeps repeating itself, that's the biggest security you can have, but it's also the biggest prison you can have. See, the idea of being in prison, being stationary, that's just for beginners. A real prison is one that runs you in a cycle. And some of us are caught in that all the time, if you look at different forms of society or economics. So far, so good? Does it feel like I've schlepped you a little bit out of? So you're going to go right back. When you leave here, you're going to say, I don't know what that was about. Eleanor just wants to be close to him, and the guy is cold. I don't know what this. What do I do this best with? I know what to do with. Okay, but when you get to a couple where it doesn't work, that's when you'll. So now let's have a look and see something else. What would help here? What would be a treatment in this complementary cycle? You see, what happens here is that when John is okay, Eleanor has to feel bad. What would happen if, when John is okay, he could help Eleanor to feel okay without his having to feel bad? That's essentially the theory of treatment, right? In other words, we're treating the couple. I'm not treating Eleanor. I'm not treating John. I'm treating the couple. If John could find a way, when he's feeling okay with himself, to get Eleanor to feel okay with herself without his having to feel not okay, we could start to move. Follow? Okay. So now we're going to take John and make him our co-therapist, right? Because the person who needs to do this is not me. If you create a triangle and I'm always making everybody feel better, that's not going to change the cycle. So how are we going to do that? See, we need to find a way that John can do something when he's feeling okay. Not when he's not feeling okay. When he's feeling okay, which happens half the time, right? When he's feeling okay, how could he help Eleanor to also feel okay, so they could put the pluses together? That's what the complementary cycle does not allow, right? Now,
those two arrows mean that John's
What's that?
Those two arrows mean that John's trying to make things okay?
So if John can stay feeling okay and help Eleanor to feel okay, then we've broken the complementary cycle, not into pieces.
It has to be when John's feeling okay.
What?
It has to be when John's feeling okay.
That's right. In other words, we want to hold him feeling good and help her to feel okay as well. Right? That's
Why that way rather than the other way?
Oh,
Can we do that?
thank you. That's this question here. But you had a question before?
My question is, I guess so answer. My question is, how could John make Eleanor feel okay without becoming too close to her?
Okay,
Be creative.
right, right. Okay, we're about to try to
People get married.
answer that question. Because complementary cycles are neat.
Why, everyone is somewhat.
People don't do them because,
He was saying that he gets engulfed because she says, "How are you?" Like this is
well, I'm making up the, I'm making it up, but
I'm saying, how did if he's so like afraid of being engulfed? Like, how did he even like guess at this boy?
his Rebbe said get married. What? Wait, just 1 second. Wait, there's a conversation.
Triggers, so we
Rivka, what do you want to say?
I'm saying it could be that John has so much, I mean, we don't want to go back to see where it originates maybe, but it could be he's had so many, this pattern has gone on so many times where he's gotten engulfed that as soon as she reaches out, it's like a trigger for him that he knows what's coming. The tidal wave is coming, he just doesn't know when.
He knows it's coming because when he came home and his mother was drunk, and she said to him, "Come and I just vomited. Clean it up for me." He said, "Oh, well, welcome home. It's always engulfing, right?
Right.
I have to take care of this lady." So that's his model, right? Now he thought that why do people get married? Because the only way out of mom is Eleanor.
It sounds very much like that book, Getting the Love You Want by what's his last name? Hendricks.
There you go. Okay.
Like that you end up marrying like your parents or whatever, your unfinished business.
You see, people get married to try to work on something. You can't work on something if it's not there, right? So you choose something that's sort of there, and then you hope that it's going to make it better instead of worse, and then you get surprised and you go to therapy, right?
That's where we come in.
It's not a good surprise, but that sounds funny, but that's what happens in couples therapy. People have trying to make this, they're familiar with it, they want to make it better, but they seem to be stuck in something bigger than them, right? Yeah.
You said before they are protecting something, right?
Right.
They're protecting something by doing that dance. They're protecting something.
Wait, talk a little louder.
When they do that dance,
There's another question without a wondering. Okay. Yeah.
when they do that dance, they protect something.
Yes. They protect their ability to be together because this is safe.
Being together is what? Because what are they protecting?
To be miserable together. People would rather be miserable together than to break apart.
People would rather.
What? A lot of people, the people that you'll see like this, not all people, right, would rather be in some relationship and suffer in the relationship than not be in a relationship.
So they are afraid of protecting their feelings.
Yes, right. So now, you asked the question, why do we start here? Why don't we start here, right? And that I sort of intimated the answer when we started. I said, when Eleanor and John both say Eleanor wants closeness. So the two of them are available to recognize Eleanor's need for closeness. Eleanor's need for closeness is overt. It's overt. I just come and look for closeness. It's less threatening to them. The fact that John runs away is, both of them say, is the result of what she does. So the fact that he comes with this worry about engulfment, he doesn't come and say, I'm running away from you, right? He does it as a result. So his difficulty is covert, right? And usually in a couple, in a complementary couple, it's not exactly equal, right? In other words, the one that is overt, and this is terribly important for couples, for therapists to realize, what's overt is easier to work with.
That's the presenting problem.
Right.
Basically, and that's why.
Right. Covert is going to be harder for them. It'll scare them, right? Now, the average therapist has this sort of yetzer to say, you think that Eleanor has a problem? What about your problem, John? Right? Let's start over here. What on earth happens to you? All she wants is a little closeness and you feel engulfed. Let's hear about your problem. Now that is not a good first choice. It's the obvious second choice. But it's not a good first choice because the fact that he's engulfed, feeling engulfed, is covert. That means that for both of them, because we're looking at them as a system, for both of them, his feeling of engulfment is more threatening than her feeling of rejection. Why? Her feeling of rejection is overt. It's right there. They can recognize it. His worry about engulfment is covert. It frightens both of them more. So a lot of times a therapist, especially male therapists, when the couple comes in and you say to yourself, I'm sick of blaming these women for wanting closeness. Let's get to your problem, right? And some of us, being men, have that problem, so we want to get to it. It's not a good choice to begin with because it threatens both of them more. That's why we start over here with Eleanor feeling rejected, which now we redeem what we said at the beginning is, why does she turn to him? Because she's feeling rejected. You see where it comes? Okay, so now we were able to say that the fact that she's rejected, that's what makes her turn to him. So let's talk about her feeling rejected first and make him a co-therapist for that. But obviously, when we're done with that, we're going to make her a co-therapist for him. We're not going to start there, though. We're going to start with what's easier for both of them, which is the presenting problem. You follow? So in couples therapy, it's a very common mistake to say, look, I'm a therapist, I'm going to balance it. Not you. You're not the only one who's crazy here. You're even more crazy. Couples out of there. And you say, why? I just uncovered the truth. And the answer is, that's why they left. That wasn't your job to uncover the truth. Wait a minute. Start with what's overt, because that's more accessible to them. It frightens them less. Yeah?
In this case, how would you know what's more overt and what's more covert if it's a feeling?
Because of the linear statement. The linear statement of both of them is it starts with Eleanor turning to John. Right? So if it starts with Eleanor turning to John, Eleanor says, every time I turn to him, he runs away. So she's saying, I need something. Right? And John says, every time she turns to me, of course I run away. Because of the way she does it. But she's also recognizing she needs something. That he needs something is covert. It's just considered to be the product of what she does. Both of them, right? So since they're telling me where to start, X marks the spot. X is where it begins, right? If it begins with Eleanor, so start with Eleanor because it's less frightening to them, okay? But now what are we going to do? Yeah.
Right. So then start when Eleanor is in the positive, I guess.
No, we're starting with Eleanor is negative.
I know what I'm saying, but right, because if Eleanor is the one who is she's the overt one. So what do you want to start when she's in the positive and John's in the negative?
No, because the fact of his engulfment, his sensitivity, is covert to both of them. And as a result, it means that it's more frightening to them. People make things covert when it's frightening to them. So the fact that Eleanor needs John is overt, right? Now, why does she need John? Because she feels rejected, right? So that is...
That's overt.
Yeah, it's overt. She says, I need him.
And so is his...
And he runs away.
He's running away, no?
No. His running away is seen as her fault.
Yeah.
Oh, so that's covert.
Right. In other words, because they start up here, right, you start over there. See, if you take the top arrow, which started as a linear statement, right? If you take the top arrow and say, if it starts here, this is the place that's easier to work on. This is the place that's harder to work on. So let's start here. So we're going to say, and if you think about the couple, it may appeal to you just sort of clinical intuition. If you say to this couple, John, you really feel engulfed so easily, you're going to lose them because it's frightening to her as well. Right? Whereas if you say to Eleanor, well, it's hard for you to, you feel distant and you want something, when you feel distant, when you feel rejected, you need help, that's not news, right? She said, that's what I've been saying all along. You got it, right? So it's more overt, less threatening, okay? All of you, when you see your first complementary couple, will make this mistake. All of you. In other words, every therapist, when they begin, they say, oh, it's obvious that she has a problem, let's balance it and find his problem. When you see how it works, you won't do it the next time. And anyway, with a complementary couple, you can imagine that the complementary cycle is pretty strong, right? And the therapist is pretty weak. So you're likely not to change very much. You can't do much harm with a complementary cycle because it'll just keep cycling, which I'm going to try to demonstrate to you either today or next time. We'll see, yeah.
You're probably going to get to it.
Okay, so look, yeah. Finally, something from the right side. Don't wonder.
What value can the counsellor add to the overt meaning?
What's that?
What value can the counsellor add to the overt meaning?
What value is it to the
No, can he add?
What's the value? What's overt is easier to work on.
What value can he add? What can he do with it?
With something that's overt? I'm about to get to that. Okay. So now we're starting here, but how do we start? What do? We say to John, we'll skip this for a minute. We say to John, listen, depending on how you work, you may, if you're a male and you're doing the couples therapy, you may say, John, come here, sit with me. Probably a woman therapist in the Haredi community wouldn't do that. But you say, listen, John, I want you to help me. I want you to help me. Here's what I want you to help me with. You and I are now going to talk to Eleanor and try to understand something about Eleanor. Now, is that individual therapy? Yes and no.
Not really, because you're doing it with
Because I'm changing his relationship with her. I'm a vehicle for changing his relationship with her, not her relationship with herself. He is going to become my co-therapist. And I say to John, listen, let's try to understand something about Eleanor. Would that be okay with you? Would that be okay with you, Eleanor, if we, John and I try to understand something a little bit better about you? And she says, sure. And so you say, well, let's, for the sake of our argument, that's what you do as a therapist. You don't say it's a fact. See, for the sake of our work, let's assume that the feeling that you have with John before you go and ask him for help, right, that's here. Before you say, John, please come closer, there's a feeling that you have that John and I can try to understand. And Eleanor says, he can understand it, he caused it, right? Is that true? Yes. Is it useful? No. In other words, the complementary cycle will keep repeating itself. So you need a lot of patience. You say, keep spinning around. I choose to focus. I say, okay, well, I got it. That's how it works between you. But let's see if John and I can understand this feeling of rejection. And John says, I don't want to understand the feeling of rejection because then she makes me and then she engulfs me. So they spin around again a couple of times. You stay with it. And you say, listen, there's something here that's very important. Let's try it this way, Eleanor. Before you met John, was it a feeling that you ever had? Just the feeling that you have when John comes home and you feel you want to be, and you're not sure that people love you enough, that people want you to be close. Is it a feeling that you ever had before you met John? And of course she says, well, I've forgotten because he keeps doing it all the time. So they spin around a few times. So you stay with it and say, well, John and I need to understand this about you. And then maybe John will help us out and say, Eleanor, you remember what you told me about your mother? Huh? Oh, you're blaming your mother? All right, spin around a few times. Well, Eleanor, how about if we just try to stay with that feeling and tell us about the feeling of coldness. Tell us about that, where that was in your life. Let's take the age of 16. 16 is a great age to use in couples therapy because it's the stuff that isn't resolved when you're 16 that you try to solve when you get married. So let's take when you were 16 and talk about what it was like to be Eleanor. And maybe John can even help and say, wow, you remember you told me about 10th grade and how they put you in cherem and whatever. And they'll spit around a few more times. You say, listen, if you can see that as something that you bring to this relationship, let's think for a moment how John could help you when you feel this way. So you have to make it hers. It's hard work.
The cycle keeps happening. You keep being stubborn. Go back to the same point. How could John help you when you feel so alone? And Eleanor will probably say, help me, he causes it. They'll spin around a few more times. You say, but John, you would think you would like to find a way to help Eleanor when she feels so bad? Because you helped me to understand. She told you about how she feels bad. So let's see what you could do that would help. Why don't you ask her what would help you, right? What would help you? Now, what will happen in these situations, and this is not the Bobermeisters, this is what happens. You see how we're working? It's precisely here. If you understand the cycle, you can put yourself precisely here and say, this is exactly where I want John to find a way to help Eleanor, not at his expense. How is it not at his expense? Because he's helping me. Right? He's helping me. He's doing the treatment. So it's not at his expense. He doesn't have to get engulfed in order to...
He's more in control.
What?
He's more in control.
He's not alone, because he's working with me. And so he's less vulnerable. And I'm helping him, rather than flip it, to find a way that he can help her, on the assumption that at some point, that's what they tried to do. They just didn't, get it right. So because of their complementary vulnerabilities. So you say, well, look, what would help you? What could John do? Look at John. You put people face to face. That's about intersubjectivity, about co-creation. You put them face to face. Say, listen, just think for a minute, Eleanor. What is it that John could do when you're feeling? Let's say you say to him, instead of come close, you say, I'm feeling alone. You say, you know that alone feeling that I told you about 10 years ago before we got into this whole mess? I'm feeling alone. What could John do when you say, I'm feeling alone? You see, that's the I position. We're helping her to say, not you do this, but I feel, right? It's just that the system is keeping them from doing it. So we've stopped the wheel in order to say, if you say to John, I'm feeling alone now, what could he do to help you? Now, it usually runs a few cycles, but in the end, Eleanor usually says, in my experience, he doesn't have to do anything. He just has to accept me with that aloneness. Because nobody accepts me with that aloneness. I can't accept myself with that aloneness. If I knew that he wouldn't run away from me, see, because I don't think he's running away from me. I think he's running away because he can't tolerate how deeply I feel alone. And John, who doesn't have a problem with aloneness, says, what are you talking about? That's all you need? I thought I have to go do Shminiot, but I have to, run and bring you this and run and bring you that. And go. All you want is for me to tell you that I still love you when you feel alone? Huh? And the answer is, that's what I need. That's what I've been looking for.
Well, that is doing something.
What's that?
That is doing something.
That's not just doing something. That's going from regulation into subjective.
Right, but I'm saying it's not that she's saying, oh, he doesn't have to do anything.
No. But
He's saying, I'm here.
He's used to trying to do regulatory things which don't work, because that's not the point. Right? In other words, what we're looking for is an intersubjective change. And the way to get to the intersubjective change is to schlep him along into helping her to recognize that what she wants from him is that he doesn't run away from her the way her parents ran away from her, and that he's able to do it. But you don't do that as content. You make it happen in the room. You put them face to face, and she says to him, when I tell you I'm alone, are you going to run away? He said, why would I run away if you're... I ran away because I thought you want to swallow me up. The fact that you feel alone isn't about me, it's about you. I don't need to run away from you. I keep running away from myself. Okay, so now John has stayed positive. He's become a helper, and he's been able to create. You see what we've done? We've stopped the cycle, but we've used the cycle in order to create something that's not regulatory. When she says to him, I don't need you to do anything, what she means is, enough with the regulation. You can't regulate my aloneness. That's not your job. But you can accept it, and that would be a profound difference, because that's intersubjective. You see, you're treating me as somebody intersubjective. The two of us are rising to a moment of creation, but that's a moment that the therapist isn't in control of. That's a moment where the therapist lets them alone. And what happens between them for a couple of minutes, that's where the change is supposed to happen. Now, you don't believe that that's going to happen until it happens. And, you know, I didn't know it was going to happen. Couples who were in treatment with me taught me this. This is what you learn because I kept trying to, you know, say, what do you need to do? What do you need to do? And they taught me, said, get off of it. He doesn't need to do anything. He needs just not to run away from me when I run away from myself. If he can love me where I don't love myself, that's what this couple is about. That's what we're about. A couple of questions, yeah.
And the husband needs, I would say, needs to be attentive and compassionate and able to have that subjective experience, which he probably doesn't really know.
Right. So where is he getting that from?
I mean, you're saying he doesn't need to do much, but you are asking him to do a lot.
Right. But I'm not asking him to see where does he get all of it from? From Naftali, from the therapist. In other words, I'm helping him. I'm not giving him a task that he can't do. I'm giving him participation in a task that we can do. How much me and how much him, that depends on him. But I'm not letting him off the hook of being a participant in it, right? But can he do it the next time at home? That's going to take some more work. That's the next level. But if you're saying, well, if he couldn't do it before, how can he do it now? That's what therapy is about what you couldn't do before and you can do now. In couples therapy, that's what happens in the room. The idea is that here and now something is being created that didn't happen before, and the therapist is helping it along, more or less overtly, but helping something to happen between them. And that's why it's not just cycling. Something's happening between them. Who is having a different experience? Both of them. It's not like she's been in the pits and he's helping her. That would be another, right? He is having a different experience of himself as somebody who can help her. As somebody who can, so when he's being intersubjective, he's being intersubjective. He's involved in the I thou, or in the intersubjective, in the co-creation, and so is she. And so you've taken a couple who came in spinning regulation, and this doesn't always happen the first session. It may take 5 sessions. The therapist has to be stubborn. You have to keep your eye on the ball. And the ball, that's where all of this discussion here has been going to, is the ball in couples therapy is not what is she feeling and what is he feeling. The ball is what's happening between the two of them and how I can make the regulation into an intersubjective moment. I choose the less of the two threatening positions, and I help one of them to help the other one. We're going to stop in a minute. You can just imagine the continuation of the treatment. Now, John has become a therapist, right? John has a much less deep trouble with himself because he's been able to do something to help Eleanor. Now is the time to help John with his engulfment, not before. I've changed him. See, we've created a moment of hope, we've created a different kind of moment, and then, based on that, now we can go to John's engulfment. And of course, the therapy isn't going to be finished until we help Eleanor to help John when he's feeling engulfed, which is the next step. So 1 or 2 last questions, and then the rest for the blog, if you remember where that is, or we'll continue next time. Yeah?
I have a bit of a complex question. Wherever you find regular couples, when Anna asks for closeness, John does provide that closeness.
Right.
Would that be regulatory rather than, would that be like regulatory as opposed to accepting her readiness?
Okay, so that's a very useful question. It may have to do with some of the couples that are in the room here. Like, you know, what about if she says come close and he comes close?
So my wife feels very abandoned that she has a mess in the house. So I should feel abandoned rather than do that. It
It looks like we're going to start the next session with that question. Is regulation always bad? Regulation, what would be the cost if you just clean up and mumble under your mustache that she's a hopeless case, and so I have to do it for her, right? The rest, next time.
I'm sorry about that.